people were spending less time with friends and more time alone even before the pandemic.
Because this has become a public health crisis as well. Right now, 1 in 2 adults in America are living with measurable levels of loneliness.
Over the past decade, loneliness has spread across America faster than any disease. Today, if you feel like you have a complete and happy social life, then statistically, you're in really good shape, because today the average American only spends half as much time with friends as they did only a decade ago. And to make matters worse, things are getting way worse really quickly, because 1 in 4 Americans today will eat every meal alone. And if you're below the age of 30 like I am, then there is a 30% chance that you feel chronically lonely. And even if you are lucky enough to have a complete, happy social life, then it's still a statistical certainty that at least a few people that you know are suffering so badly from loneliness that it's causing them to have an anxiety disorder or even depression. Which is why in today's video, I'm going to break down everything that you need to know about America's loneliness epidemic, how we got here, what it's doing to people, what it's doing to the country at large, and ultimately, how you can try and escape the trap of loneliness if you're unfortunately in that position. So there are a ton of reasons why Americans are becoming more lonely every year, but I'm only going to focus on 6 of the biggest contributors. The first being that Americans just move insanely often nowadays. Today, the typical American will move 5 or 6 times between the ages of 18 and 45 alone. And what this means is that inevitably, if you do form a friend group, that is going to be split apart because someone is going to have to move away for work. And then a couple of years later, someone's going to move away to be closer to family. And within just a few years' time, it's super easy for a friend group to go from being consolidated within only a few miles to being spread out across the country. Now, to be clear, this isn't a new phenomenon. Americans didn't just start magically moving overnight, but it is a development in a sense because the average American moves more often nowadays and they move on average further away when they do move. And speaking from experience, when that happens, it becomes really hard to start planning stuff because it used to be when everyone's together that you could just go see friends whenever you wanted to. But when people live hundreds or even 1,000+ miles away, it can take weeks or even months of planning to get together with a friend. But even if you're lucky enough to still have all of your friends in the same town, you still might not be able to afford to hang out with your friends because today, some 70% of Americans are financially unhealthy, which means that their disposable income is rapidly dwindling. And I want to put this into perspective. Imagine that after rent, after groceries, after utilities, and all other necessities, that you have about $200 left over every month to spend however you want to. That's not that bad. That might give you 8 to 10 times out with friends every month to be able to go bowling, play putt-putt, whatever you might do with friends to hang out. But then your rent goes up, as is the case if you look online for a lot of people. And when that happens, you might only have $100 or even $50 left over every month for spending on what you want to. And that means that instead of being able to see people twice a week to do cool things, you might only be able to afford to do it every week or every other week even. And when people are put in that scenario, they're often forced to choose. Would they rather keep spending time and money on friends, or would they rather pay for a streaming service or a book or some other form of entertainment that's going to last for weeks instead of only for a few hours? Which might sound hypothetical, but speaking from experience as someone who's been in that boat, this is a really real problem that a lot of Americans are facing, and it's only getting worse as people's financial well-being continues to deteriorate. And that takes us into the third reason why Americans are becoming more lonely, because when they do hang out with friends, they don't do it in person as often as they used to. In fact, texting is more common than phone calls today, and in-person hangouts are rapidly becoming a thing of the past. Now, this makes sense because if your friends are spread out across cities, or if you can't afford to hang out with friends in person to go get dinner or to go do a cool hobby together, then it makes sense that you'd replace that time with texting or phone calls. But this introduces problems of its own because every piece of data that we have on the subject shows that texting is a very poor substitute for phone calls. And phone calls in turn are a poor substitute for in-person hangouts. But if people are hanging out via text nowadays, which again is more common than phone calls, then that just makes it really hard for people to have their social itch filled, even if they're spending time with other people. Now, before I go on to the fourth reason, I want to take a quick moment to say that if you are feeling lonely and like you don't have a complete or happy social life, then I understand, and I'm really sorry that you're going through that. I've been where you are. I know how painful it can be, and I wish you all of the best. I hope that you're able to make some new friends or to reconnect with some old ones, and that this phase comes to an end in your life fairly quickly. Reason 4 is that people struggle to find the time to hang out with friends anymore. Today, the typical American commutes back and forth to work for 53 minutes a day. Most Americans work full-time, and based on the length of their lunch break, that means they work for 42 and a half or 45 hours a week, at least officially. And so after work, after a long commute, and after making dinner and maybe some chores, it doesn't leave a lot of time in the evenings to hang out with friends. But this fact is becoming more complicated in recent years because many Americans are reporting that they don't feel comfortable spending the evening entirely relaxing. In fact, there's a growing trend of Americans who feel a compulsive need to check their work email, Microsoft Teams, or some other work platform every evening. Because of course, nothing screams having free time in the evening like texting or emailing your boss back at 8:04 p.m. And this directly cuts into people's time to spend time with friends or with family. And so even when people do want to spend time with friends, it can become a struggle to have that time, at least if they want to also have a healthy sleep schedule. But even if you have time and money to be able to hang out with people, still you might struggle to be able to actually meet new people to hang out with. The ways that people tend to tell you to find new friends is to just go out and meet people. Maybe go to a bar and try and hang out with some new people there. But for many, there's a stigma around doing so. And if you're more into niche hobbies, say you're into Pokemon or even into running, it can be hard to find a local accessible group for these things. Now, there are Facebook groups that help people find other groups that they would enjoy hanging out with in person. And these groups are great and there's a lot of value in them. But for many, there is a huge barrier to entry to feeling comfortable trying to join a group that's pre-established. After all, you can go to a runner's club if you're into running, but if everyone already feels like they're friends there, then it's pretty easy to feel like you're an outsider and like you're not really making friends there so much as joining in with a group that already exists. Now, I'm going to be real with you. I don't have a lot of actual statistical data showcasing this one like I do for the other points, but I know too many people who have said that they just don't feel comfortable inserting themselves into groups, even if they know they exist. And if you look online, there are a ton of posts on Quora, on Reddit, on all sorts of online forums where people are talking about having a social anxiety about going to groups that they don't feel like they're going to be welcomed into. And whether that's in their head or in practice, that does serve as a meaningful barrier to entry. And as we'll talk about later in the video, because loneliness and anxiety are interchanged and interlinked, that can make this even more complicated. So it needs to be mentioned. And that takes us to the final reason, which is that a sense of community has largely disappeared in most towns and cities in America. It used to be that just by the virtue of being neighbors or living in the same town with people, that you could make friends and acquaintances with them. And I think in large part that was because of community groups and local identity. But today, community groups are deteriorating. And I've talked about this at length before, but the short story is only a few decades ago, if you were in a town where for whatever reason you didn't know a lot of people and you wanted to make more friends, you could join Rotary, Kiwanis, Lions, or any number of other community groups, and you would be welcomed with open arms just by the virtue of you being in that community. After all, if a runner's club is to try and get people to come together about running, community groups and community clubs were there mainly to foster a sense of community, which meant that there was a really low barrier to entry. But groups like these are rapidly vanishing from America as their membership fades. And this means that there aren't a whole lot of secular places where people can go to knowing that no matter what they're into, that they're going to be accepted with welcome arms just by virtue of being there. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention religious groups, because for most of American history, religion was a very important part of the social fabric, regardless of which denomination of Christianity or even other major religions we're discussing. If you went every week to a religious service, you would meet people who you would otherwise probably never come into contact with. And because most major religions are so focused on trying to bring together people and trying to be accessible for people, these were places where you could continuously go that had a structure around them where you could meet people and develop a sense of community, even if you were new to an area. But religion is losing popularity in America, with many flocking to agnosticism or atheism. Now, regardless of your opinion on religion, this has an effect on the loneliness epidemic, because for people who would otherwise find a sense of community at a religious group who are now rejecting religion, that means that there's just less places for them to go to meet people. And when we combine that with the decline of community groups, it means there aren't a lot of places for people today to go in a small area or even in a big town to meet people where they know that they're going to be welcomed with open arms, no matter who they are or what they're interested in. And all of this taken together shows us why America has a loneliness epidemic. Frankly, it's hard to meet people. And then if you do meet people, it's hard to find the time or money to hang out with them. And even if you do hang out with them and grow a deep, meaningful relationship with someone, inevitably one of you is going to move away, which means that you're probably going to start texting or calling that person instead of seeing them in person, which is never going to be as fulfilling as the old time you had together in person. And this creates a vicious cycle where people just don't have close friends anymore, at least not close friends that they actually see regularly in the real world. Which means it's little wonder that the loneliness epidemic has seized America and is getting worse every year. But the next natural question is, what is this doing to the country? What are the actual consequences of loneliness infecting America like a plague? There are three main costs to the loneliness epidemic that I want to cover in detail. The first is how it utterly destroys people's mental health. 81% of adults who report feeling lonely also report feeling anxiety or even depression, which means that if you had a friend group of 5 people that were all socially fulfilled until one by one you all moved away, then 4 out of 5 of you would likely end up developing some mental health issues, in part because of your loneliness. And that is a problem in my opinion. And while I'm no therapist or psychiatrist, the fact that 81% of people who are lonely are also anxious or depressed, and the fact that 30% of young people today are lonely, well, those numbers when put together cause me great concern, because these aren't just statistics on a piece of paper. They aren't numbers. They're people who are struggling. And for that reason, the sheer human cost of the loneliness epidemic, in my opinion, is by far the largest and most significant. But it doesn't stop there, because people who are lonely don't just internalize those feelings, and it doesn't just cause them to suffer. It bleeds out into society, causing massive macroeconomical cost. To begin with, on our second reason, depressed and anxious people are less productive at work, and that is costing employers a fortune every year. Already, depression costs employers roughly $200 billion every year just because people miss work because they're depressed, or because they're less efficient when they're at work if they're depressed. And like I said before, loneliness doesn't just highly correlate with depression, it also correlates heavily with anxiety. And anxiety costs employers somewhere around $300 billion a year. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. Job stress and loneliness aren't the same thing, but anxiety doesn't just fit neatly into a box, because you might be stressed at your job and that might cause you to be less productive there, but then you come home and have no outlet because you're lonely in your personal life, which further amplifies the stress that you're feeling at your job. Now, that means that no matter how we want to look at it, at the bare minimum, the correlation between loneliness and anxiety and depression means that loneliness is costing employers at minimum $200 billion a year. It's probably correlated with at least $500 billion a year, and potentially more than even that. And that leads us into the third reason that this is a crisis that needs to be addressed with major ramifications, because if employers are losing money, it means that also the economy in general is suffering, because less productive employees means less productive workers, which means less productive economy. And to give you an idea for how significant the scale of this is, in Singapore, there was some fascinating research on their loneliness epidemic that found that roughly 3% of their GDP, their gross domestic product, was lost to them because of loneliness. And if we're super conservative and say that America only has half as much of an effect on GDP from loneliness, which I think is beyond conservative personally, but let's just go with it, then that means that America's GDP is down by $408 billion a year because of the loneliness epidemic. And just to give you an idea of what that means for the government and for the economy in general, that is not one, not two, not three, not four, but 4.5 times as big of an impact on the GDP as the yearly seasonal flu is. And the government every year puts a ton of money toward trying to fight the flu because it realizes it's a huge health and economic problem. But loneliness, which has way bigger of an impact on the economy and on people's mental health, until 2023 was all but ignored. Which naturally leads to the question of how do we fix this? Because something needs to be done. Really quickly, if you made it to this point in the video, I want to say thank you for watching this far, and that I would really appreciate it if you consider subscribing. It goes so far to helping the channel grow, and it means the world to me. Thank you for making it to this point in the video. And speaking of, let's get back to it. Now, normally this is the part of the video where I would tell you what government solution that we need to enact, what policy would fix everything we've been discussing up until this point in the video. Sadly, I don't think there is a quick fix. Because as we saw earlier, there are 6 major distinctive reasons why we got here in the first place. And of those reasons, very few, if any of them, can be solved by the government. Which means that unfortunately, it's up to individuals to try and solve this crisis. And I know how hard that is going to be to fix things, but it's pretty much the only way out. Which is why I wanted to share a few strategies that I have personally seen work and that I've found a ton of evidence for online that others have seen work for them on how to get out of being lonely if you're in that position. The first is really simple. Try and find someone from your past life or a new friend potentially that you can schedule a weekly hangout with. Now, I know the difficulties of it, but it doesn't have to be a lot to begin with. Even if someone just is spending 30 minutes a week on the phone with you every Monday night at 7 p.m., for example, that can go a really long way. The key here is consistency. Whether you're talking to a parent or to an old friend or a cousin, whomever you're speaking with, it doesn't matter. The continuous, consistent basis that you talk to someone in is what really helps drive the impact on fixing loneliness, because if you can do that with one person, then you can start to do it with a second person and maybe a third person. And even though phone calls are inferior to in-person hangouts, they're better than nothing, and they can go a really long way to helping give you a sense of a full social life. Beyond that, if you're trying to make new friends, there is a lot to be said for trying to find groups of friends on Facebook. Now, it's not perfect and there can be barriers to entry problems, but I know people who have found really big success in trying to find a soccer club, a runners club, or any other type of sport league or niche interest hobby on Facebook in their area to connect with. But if you don't have any success with social media groups that you find, you can also try to go to in-person stores that service a specific hobby. So if you are really into gaming and you go to a local game store, they can usually point you in the right direction for other groups that are like you that you might be able to fit into. So that's always a useful strategy that I've seen work as well. And then finally, something that I have to mention as someone who's a big believer in social community groups is that you can still join groups like Rotary, Lions, or Kiwanis. I'll be honest, they're not for everyone. They have their problems and they aren't free, which I know can be a massive barrier to entry, and they ask a lot out of members in terms of service projects. But if you're willing to at least give it a shot, for some people, it is an amazing solution because it's a way to help give back to your community and to get to know your community. No matter what, I understand how hard this problem is, but collectively we have to recognize that there is no quick fix for it. The only thing we can do is encourage people who are lonely to meet new friends. And if you are fortunate enough to not feel alone in life, to feel like you have a complete social life, then something I would encourage you to do is reach out to an old friend or to someone at work who you think might be lonely, because you don't know what they're going through. But loneliness is heavily correlated with anxiety and depression. And so once someone becomes lonely, it's often hard for them to take the first steps. So if you can take the first step, if you're in a position to do so, to try and encourage them to come and hang out with you, even if it's every once in a while, that can make a really big difference. Together, we can fix this culturally, but there's no policy that's going to fix this overnight. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that this video was helpful and informative. And if you did find it interesting and want to learn more about America's community groups and their decline, I encourage you to watch this video next to learn more about them. Thanks again for watching, and I wish you all the best.